Chapter 11. Half an hour later, Nikolai Petrovich went into the garden to his favorite arbor. He was overtaken by melancholy thoughts. For the first time, he realized clearly the distance between him and his son. He foresaw that every day it would grow wider and wider. In vain, then, had he spent whole days, sometimes in the winter, at Petersburg over the newest books. In vain had he listened to the talk of the young men. In vain had he rejoiced when he succeeded in putting in his word, too, in their heated discussions. My brother says we are right, he thought. And apart from all vanity, I do think myself that they are further from the truth than we are. Though at the same time I feel there is something behind them we have not got, some superiority over us. Is it youth? No, not only youth. Doesn't their superiority consist in there being fewer traces of the slave owner in them than in us? Nikolai Petrovich's head sank despondently, and he passed his hand over his face. But to renounce poetry? He thought again. To have no feeling for art, for nature? And he looked round as though trying to understand how it was possible to have no feeling for nature. It was already evening. The sun was hidden behind a small copse of aspens which lay a quarter of a mile from the garden. Its shadow stretched indefinitely across the still fields. A peasant on a white nag went at a trot along the dark, narrow path close beside the copse. His whole figure was clearly visible even to the patch on his shoulder, in spite of his being in the shade. The horse's hooves flew along bravely. The sun's rays from the farther side fell full on the copse, and piercing through its thickets, threw such a warm light on the aspen trunks that they looked like pines. And their leaves were almost a dark blue, while above them rose a pale blue sky, faintly tinged by the glow of sunset. The swallows flew high. The wind had quite died away. Belated bees hummed slowly and drowsily among the lilac blossom. A swarm of midges hung like a cloud over a solitary branch which stood out against the sky. How beautiful, my God, thought Nikolai Petrovich. And his favorite verses were almost on his lips. He remembered Arkady's Stoff und Kraft and was silent. But still he sat there, still he gave himself up to the sorrowful consolation of solitary thought. He was fond of dreaming. His country life had developed the tendency in him. How short a time ago he had been dreaming like this, waiting for his son at the posting station. And what a change already since that day. Their relations that were then undefined were defined now, and how defined? Again, his dead wife came back to his imagination, but not as he had known her for many years, not as the good domestic housewife, but as a young girl, with a slim figure, innocently inquiring eyes, and a tight twist of hair on her childish neck. He remembered how he had seen her for the first time. He was still a student then. He had met her on the staircase of his lodgings, and jostling by accident against her, he tried to apologize and could only mutter, "Pardon, monsieur," while she bowed, smiled, and suddenly seemed frightened and ran away, though at the bend of the staircase she had glanced rapidly at him, assumed a serious air, and blushed. Afterwards, the first timid visits, the half-words, the half-smiles, and embarrassment, and melancholy, and yearnings, and at last, that breathing rapture. Where had it all vanished? She had been his wife. He had been happy as few on earth are happy. But, he mused, these sweet first moments, why could not one live an eternal, undying life in them? He did not try to make his thought clear to himself, but he felt that he longed to keep that blissful time by something stronger than memory. He longed to feel his Maria near him again, to have the sense of her warmth and breathing, and already he could fancy that over him. Nikolai Petrovich, came the sound of Fienichka's voice close by him. "Where are you?" He started. He felt no pang, no shame. He never even admitted the possibility of comparison between his wife and Fienichka. But he was sorry she had thought of coming to look for him. Her voice had brought back to him at once his gray hairs, his age, his reality. The enchanted world into which he was just stepping, which was just rising out of the dim mists of the past, was shaken and vanished. "I'm here," he answered. "I'm coming, run along." There it is, the traces of the slave owner flashed through his mind. Fienichka peeped into the arbor at him without speaking and disappeared, while he noticed with astonishment that the night had come on while he had been dreaming. Everything around was dark and hushed. Fienichka's face had glimmered so pale and slight before him. He got up and was about to go home, but the emotion stirred in his heart could not be soothed at once, and he began slowly walking about the garden, sometimes looking at the ground at his feet, and then raising his eyes towards the sky, where swarms of stars were twinkling. He walked a great deal, till he was almost tired out, while the restlessness within him, a kind of yearning, vague, melancholy restlessness, still was not appeased. Oh, how Bazarov would have laughed at him if he had known what was passing within him then. Arkady himself would have condemned him. He, a man 44 years old, an agriculturist and a farmer, was shedding tears. Causeless tears. This was 100 times worse than the violoncello. Nikolai Petrovich continued walking and could not make up his mind to go into the house, into the snug, peaceful nest which looked out at him so hospitably from all its lighted windows. He had not the force to tear himself away from the darkness, the garden, the sense of the fresh air in his face, from that melancholy, that restless craving. At a turn in the path, he was met by Pavel Petrovich. "What's the matter with you?" he asked Nikolai Petrovich. "You're as white as a ghost. You're not well. Why don't you go to bed?" Nikolai Petrovich explained to him briefly his state of feeling and moved away. Pavel Petrovich went to the end of the garden, and he too grew thoughtful. And he too raised his eyes towards the heavens. But in his beautiful dark eyes, nothing was reflected but the light of the stars. He was not born an idealist, and his fastidiously dry and sensuous soul, with its French tinge of cynicism, was not capable of dreaming. "Do you know what?" Bazarov was saying to Arkady the same night. "I've got a splendid idea. Your father was saying today that he'd had an invitation from your illustrious relative. Your father's not going. Let us be off to X. You know the worthy man invites you too. You see what fine weather it is. We'll stroll about and look at the town. We'll have 5 or 6 days outing and enjoy ourselves." "And you'll come back here again?" "No, I must go to my father's. You know, he lives about 25 miles from X. I've not seen him for a long while, and my mother too. I must cheer the old people up. They've been good to me, especially my father. He's awfully funny. I'm their only one, too." "And will you be along with them?" "I don't suppose so. It will be dull, of course." "And you'll come to us on your way back?" "I don't know. I'll see. Well, what do you say? Shall we go?" "If you like," observed Arkady languidly. In his heart, he was highly delighted with his friend's suggestion, but he thought it a duty to conceal his feeling. He was not a nihilist for nothing. The next day he set off with Bazarov to X. The younger part of the household at Mariina were sorry at their going. Dunyasha even cried. But the old folks breathed more easily. Chapter 12. The town of X, to which our friends set off, was in the jurisdiction of a governor who was a young man, and at once a progressive and a despot, as often happens with Russians. Before the end of the first year of his government, he had managed to quarrel not only with the marshal of nobility, a retired officer of the guards who kept open house and a stud of horses, but even with his own subordinates. The feuds arising from this cause assumed at last such proportions that the ministry in Petersburg had found it necessary to send down a trusted personage with a commission to investigate it all on the spot. The choice of the authorities fell upon Matvey Ilyich Kolyazin, the son of the Kolyazin under whose protection the brothers Kirsanov had once found themselves. He too was a young man. That is to say, he had not long passed 40, but he was already on the high road to becoming a statesman, and wore a star on each side of his breast, one, to be sure, a foreign star, not of the first magnitude. Like the governor whom he had come down to pass judgment upon, he was reckoned a progressive, and though he was already a bigwig, he was not like the majority of bigwigs. He had the highest opinion of himself. His vanity knew no bounds, but he behaved simply, listened condescendingly, and laughed so good-naturedly that on a first acquaintance he might even be taken for a jolly good fellow. On important occasions, however, he knew, as the saying is, how to make his authority felt. Energy is essential, he used to say then. L'énergie est la première qualité d'un homme d'État. And for all that, he was usually taken in, and any moderately experienced official could turn him round his finger. Matvey Ilyich used to speak with great respect of Guizot, and tried to impress everyone with the idea that he did not belong to the class of routiniers and high and dry bureaucrats, that not a single phenomenon of social life passed unnoticed by him. All such phrases were very familiar to him. He even followed, with dignified indifference, it is true, the development of contemporary literature. So a grown man who meets a procession of small boys in the street will sometimes walk after it. In reality, Matvey Ilyich had not got much beyond those political men of the days of Alexander, who used to prepare for an evening party at Madame Svietchin's by reading a page of Condillac. Only his methods were different, more modern. He was an adroit courtier, a great hypocrite, and nothing more. He had no special aptitude for affairs and no intellect, but he knew how to manage his own business successfully. No one could get the better of him there, and, to be sure, that's the principal thing. Matvey Ilyich received Arkady with the good nature, we might even call it playfulness, characteristic of the enlightened higher official. He was astonished, however, when he heard that the cousins he had invited had remained at home in the country. "Your father was always a queer fellow," he remarked, playing with the tassels of his magnificent velvet dressing gown, and suddenly turning to a young official in a discreetly buttoned-up uniform, he cried with an air of concentrated attention, "What?" The young man, whose lips were glued together from prolonged silence, got up and looked in perplexity at his chief. But, having nonplussed his subordinate, Matvey Ilyich paid him no further attention. Our higher officials are fond, as a rule, of nonplussing their subordinates. The methods to which they have recourse to attain that end are rather various. The following means, among others, is in great vogue, is quite a favorite, as the English say. A high official suddenly ceases to understand the simplest words, assuming total deafness. He will ask, for instance, "What's today?" He is respectfully informed, "Today's Friday, Your Excellency." "Eh? What? What's that? What do you say?" The great man repeats with intense attention. "Today's Friday, Your Excellency." "Eh? What? What's Friday? What Friday?" "Friday, Your Excellency, the day of the week." "What, do you pretend to teach me, eh?" Matvey Ilyich was a higher official all the same, though he was reckoned a liberal. "I advise you, my dear boy, to go and call on the governor," he said to Arkady. "You understand, I don't advise you to do so because I adhere to old-fashioned ideas of the necessity of paying respect to authorities, but simply because the governor's a very decent fellow. Besides, you probably want to make acquaintance with the society here. You're not a bear, I hope? And he's giving a great ball the day after tomorrow." "Will you be at the ball?" inquired Arkady. "He gives it in my honor," answered Matvey Ilyich, almost pityingly. "Do you dance?" Yes, I dance, but not well. That's a pity. There are pretty girls here, and it's a disgrace for a young man not to dance. Again, I don't say that through any old-fashioned ideas. I don't in the least imagine that a man's wit lies in his feet. But Byronism is ridiculous. Il a fait son temps. But, Uncle, it's not through Byronism. I will introduce you to the ladies here. I will take you under my wing, interrupted Matvey Ilyich, and he laughed complacently. You'll find it warm, eh? A servant entered and announced the arrival of the superintendent of the Crown Domains, a mild-eyed old man with deep creases round his mouth, who was excessively fond of nature, especially on a summer day when, in his words, every little busy bee takes a little bribe from every little flower. Arkady withdrew. He found Bazarov at the tavern where they were staying, and was a long while persuading him to go with him to the governor's. Well, there's no help for it, said Bazarov at last. It's no good doing things by halves. We came to look at the gentry, let's look at them. The governor received the young men affably, but he did not ask them to sit down, nor did he sit down himself. He was in an everlasting fuss and hurry. In the morning, he used to put on a tight uniform and an excessively stiff cravat. He never ate or drank enough. He was forever making arrangements. He invited Kirsanov and Bazarov to his ball, and within a few minutes invited them a second time, regarding them as brothers and calling them Kisarov. They were on their way home from the governor's when suddenly a short man in a Slavophile national dress leaped out of a carriage that was passing them and crying, "Yevgeny Vasilyevich!" dashed up to Bazarov. "Ah, it's you, Herr Sitnikov," observed Bazarov, still stepping along on the pavement. "By what chance did you come here?" "Fancy, absolutely by chance," he replied, and returning to the carriage, he waved his hand several times and shouted, "Follow us! My father had business here," he went on, hopping across the gutter. "And so he asked me. I heard today of your arrival and have already been to see you." The friends did, in fact, on returning to their room, find there a card with the corners turned down bearing the name of Sitnikov, on one side in French, on the other in Slavonic characters. "I hope you are not coming from the governor's." "It's no use to hope. We come straight from him." "Ah, in that case, I will call on him too. Yevgeny Vasilyevich introduced me to the Sitnikov Kirsanov," mumbled Bazarov, not stopping. "I am greatly flattered," began Sitnikov, walking sidewise, smirking and hurriedly pulling off his really over-elegant gloves. "I have heard so much. I am an old acquaintance of Yevgeny Vasilyevich, and I may say his disciple. I am indebted to him for my regeneration." Arkady looked at Bazarov's disciple. There was an expression of excitement and dullness imprinted on the small but pleasant features of his well-groomed face. His small eyes, which seemed squeezed in, had a fixed and uneasy look. And his laugh, too, was uneasy, a sort of short, wooden laugh. "Would you believe it," he pursued, "when Yevgeny Vasilyevich for the first time said before me that it was not right to accept any authorities, I felt such enthusiasm, as though my eyes were opened. Here, I thought, at last I have found a man. By the way, Yevgeny Vasilyevich, you positively must come to know a lady here who is really capable of understanding you, and for whom your visit would be a real festival. You have heard of her, I suppose." "Who is it?" Bazarov brought out unwillingly. "Kukshina Evdoxia Kukshin. She's a remarkable nature. Emancipée, in the true sense of the word, an advanced woman. Do you know what? We'll all go together to see her now. She lives only 2 steps from here. We will have lunch there. I suppose you have not lunched yet." "No, not yet." "Well, that's capital. She has separated, you understand, from her husband. She's not dependent on anyone." "Is she pretty?" Bazarov cut in. "No, one couldn't say that." "Then what the devil are you asking us to see her for?" "Fie, you must have your joke. She will give us a bottle of champagne." "Oh, that's it. One can see the practical man at once. By the way, is your father still in the gin business?" "Yes," said Sitnikov hurriedly, and he gave a shrill, spasmodic laugh. "Well, will you come?" "I don't really know." You wanted to see people? Go along, said Arkady in an undertone. And what do you say to it, Mr. Kirsanov? Sitnikov put in. You must come too. We can't go without you. But how can we burst in upon her all at once? That's no matter. Kukshina's a brick. There will be a bottle of champagne? Asked Bazarov. 3, cried Sitnikov. That I answer for. What with? My own head. Your father's purse would be better. However, we are coming. Chapter 13. The small gentleman's house in the Moscow style in which Avdotya Nikitishna, otherwise Evdoksya Kukshin, lived, was in one of the streets of X, which had been lately burnt down. It's well known that our provincial towns are burnt down every 5 years. At the door, above a visiting card nailed on all askew, there was a bell handle to be seen. And in the hall, the visitors were met by someone not exactly a servant, nor exactly a companion, in a cap, unmistakable tokens of the progressive tendencies of the lady of the house. Sitnikov inquired whether Avdotya Nikitishna was at home. Is that you, Victor? Sounded a shrill voice from the adjoining room. Come in. The woman in the cap disappeared at once. I'm not alone, observed Sitnikov with a sharp look at Arkady and Bazarov as he briskly pulled off his overcoat, beneath which appeared something of the nature of a coachman's velvet jacket. No matter, answered the voice. Entrez. The young men went in. The room into which they walked was more like a working study than a drawing room. Papers, letters, fat numbers of Russian journals, for the most part uncut, lay at random on the dusty tables. White cigarette ends lay scattered in every direction. On a leather-covered sofa, a lady, still young, was half reclining. Her fair hair was rather disheveled. She wore a silk gown, not perfectly tidy, heavy bracelets on her short arms, and a lace handkerchief on her head. She got up from the sofa, and carelessly drawing a velvet cape trimmed with yellowish ermine over her shoulders, she said languidly, Good morning, Victor, and pressed Sitnikov's hand. Bazarov, Kirsanov, he announced abruptly in imitation of Bazarov. Delighted, answered Madame Kukshin, and fixing on Bazarov a pair of round eyes, between which was a forlorn little turned-up red nose. I know you, she added, and pressed his hand too. Bazarov scowled. There was nothing repulsive in the little plain person of the emancipated woman, but the expression of her face produced a disagreeable effect on the spectator. One felt impelled to ask her, What's the matter? Are you hungry? Or bored? Or shy? What are you in a fidget about? Both she and Sitnikov had always the same uneasy air. She was extremely unconstrained and at the same time awkward. She obviously regarded herself as a good-natured, simple creature, and all the while, whatever she did, it always struck one that it was not just what she wanted to do. Everything with her seemed, as children say, done on purpose. That's to say, not simply, not naturally. Yes, I know you, Bazarov, she repeated. She had the habit, peculiar to many provincial and Moscow ladies, of calling men by their surnames from the first day of acquaintance with them. Will you have a cigar? A cigar's all very well, put in Sitnikov, who by now was lolling in an armchair, his legs in the air. But give us some lunch. We're awfully hungry. And tell them to bring us up a little bottle of champagne. Sybarite, commented Evdoksya, and she laughed. When she laughed, the gum showed above her upper teeth. Isn't it true, Bazarov, he's a Sybarite? I like comfort in life, Sitnikov brought out with dignity. That does not prevent my being a liberal. No, it does prevent it, cried Evdoksya. She gave directions, however, to her maid, both as regards the lunch and the champagne. What do you think about it? She added, turning to Bazarov. I'm persuaded you share my opinion. Well, no, retorted Bazarov. A piece of meat's better than a piece of bread, even from the chemical point of view. You are studying chemistry? That is my passion. I've even invented a new sort of composition myself. The composition? You? Yes. And do you know for what purpose? To make dolls' heads so that they shouldn't break. I'm practical too, you see. But everything's not quite ready yet. I've still to read Libby. By the way, have you read Kislakov's article on female labor in the Moscow Gazette? Read it, please. You're interested in the woman question, I suppose, and in the schools too? What did your friend do? What is his name? Madame Kukshin shed her questions one after another with affected negligence, not waiting for an answer. Spoiled children talk so to their nurses. My name's Arkady Nikolaevich Kirsanov, said Arkady, and I'm doing nothing. Evdoksya giggled. How charming. What, don't you smoke? Victor, do you know I'm very angry with you? What for? They tell me you've begun singing the praises of George Sand again. A retrograde woman and nothing else. How can people compare her with Emerson? She hasn't an idea on education, nor physiology, nor anything. She'd never, I'm persuaded, heard of embryology, and in these days, what can be done without that? Evdoksya even threw up her hands. What a wonderful article Yelisyevich has written on that subject. He's a gentleman of genius. Evdoksya constantly made use of the word gentleman instead of the word man. Bazarov, sit by me on the sofa. You don't know, perhaps, I'm awfully afraid of you. Why so, allow me to ask? You're a dangerous gentleman. You're such a critic. Good God, yes. Why, how absurd. I'm talking like some country lady. I really am a country lady, though. I manage my property myself, and only fancy my steward, Yerofei, is a wonderful type, quite like Cooper's Pathfinder. Something in him so spontaneous. I've come to settle here finally. It's an intolerable town, isn't it? But what's one to do? The town's like every town, Bazarov remarked coolly. All its interests are so petty, that's what's so awful. I used to spend the winters in Moscow, but now my lawful spouse, Monsieur Kukshin's residing there. And besides, Moscow nowadays, I don't know, it's not the same as it was. I'm thinking of going abroad. Last year I was on the point of setting off. To Paris, I suppose? Queried Bazarov. To Paris and to Heidelberg. Why to Heidelberg? How can you ask? Why, Bunsen's there. To this Bazarov could find no reply. Pierre Sapozhnikov. Do you know him? No, I don't. Not know Pierre Sapozhnikov? He's always at Lydia Khestatov's. I don't know her either. Well, it was he undertook to escort me. Thank God I'm independent. I have no children. What was that I said? Thank God? It's no matter, though. Evdoksya rolled a cigarette up between her fingers, which were brown with tobacco stains, put it to her tongue, licked it up, and began smoking. The maid came in with a tray. Ah, here's lunch. Will you have an appetizer first? Victor, open the bottle. That's in your line. Yes, it's in my line, muttered Sitnikov, and again he gave vent to the same convulsive laugh. Are there any pretty women here? Inquired Bazarov as he drank off a third glass. Yes, there are, answered Evdoksya, but they're all such empty-headed creatures. Mon ami Odintsova, for instance, is nice looking. It's a pity her reputation's rather doubtful. That wouldn't matter, though. But she's no independence in her views, no width, nothing of all that. The whole system of education wants changing. I've thought a great deal about it. Our women are very badly educated. There's no doing anything with them, put in Sitnikov. One ought to despise them, and I do despise them fully and completely. The possibility of feeling and expressing contempt was the most agreeable sensation to Sitnikov. He used to attack women in especial, never suspecting that it was to be his fate, a few months later, to be cringing before his wife, merely because she had been born a princess Durdoleosov. Not a single one of them would be capable of understanding our conversation. Not a single one deserves to be spoken of by serious men like us. But there's not the least need for them to understand our conversation, observed Bazarov. Whom do you mean? Put in Evdoksya. Pretty women. What? Do you adopt Proudhon's ideas then? Bazarov drew himself up haughtily. I don't adopt anyone's ideas. I have my own. Damn all authorities, shouted Sitnikov, delighted to have a chance of expressing himself boldly before the man he slavishly admired. But even Macaulay, Madame Kukshin was beginning. Damn Macaulay, thundered Sitnikov. Are you going to stand up for the silly hussies? For silly hussies, no, but for the rights of women, which I have sworn to defend to the last drop of my blood. Damn. But here Sitnikov stopped. But I don't deny them, he said. No, I see you're a Slavophile. No, I'm not a Slavophile, though, of course. No, you are a Slavophile. You're an advocate of patriarchal despotism. You want to have the whip in your hand. The whip's an excellent thing, remarked Bazarov. But we've got to the last drop. Of what? Interrupted Evdoksya. Of champagne, most honored Avdotya Nikitishna. Of champagne, not of your blood. I can never listen calmly when women are attacked, pursued Evdoksya. It's awful, awful. Instead of attacking them, you'd better read Michelet's book, De l'Amour. That's exquisite. Gentlemen, let us talk of love, added Evdoksya, letting her arm fall languidly on the rumpled sofa cushion. A sudden silence followed. No, why should we talk of love? Said Bazarov. But you mentioned just now a Madame Odintsova. That was what you called her, I think. Who is that lady? She's charming, piped Sitnikov. I will introduce you. Clever, rich, a widow. It's a pity she's not yet advanced enough. She ought to see more of our Evdoksya. I drink to your health, Evdoksy. Let us clink glasses. Et toc, et ting, ting, ting. Et toc, et ting, ting, ting. Victor, you're a wretch. The lunch dragged on a long while. The first bottle of champagne was followed by another, a third, and even a fourth. Evdoksya chattered without pause. Sitnikov seconded her. They had much discussion upon the question whether marriage was a prejudice or a crime, and whether men were born equal or not, and precisely what individuality consists in. Things came at last to Evdoksya, flushed from the wine she had drunk, tapping with her flat fingertips on the keys of a discordant piano, and beginning to sing in a hoarse voice first gypsy songs, and then Seymour Schiff's song, Granada Lies Slumbering, while Sitnikov tied a scarf round his head and represented the dying lover, the words, "And thy lips to mine in burning kiss entwine." Arkady could not stand it at last. Gentlemen, it's getting something like bedlam, he remarked aloud. Bazarov, who had at rare intervals put in an ironical word in the conversation, he paid more attention to the champagne, gave a loud yawn, got up, and without taking leave of their hostess, he walked off with Arkady. Sitnikov jumped up and followed him. Well, what do you think of her? He inquired, skipping obsequiously from right to left of them. I told you see, a remarkable personality. If we only had more women like that, she is in her own way an expression of the highest morality. And is that establishment of your governors an expression of the highest morality too? Observed Bazarov, pointing to a gin shop which they were passing at that instant. Sitnikov again went off into a shrill laugh. He was greatly ashamed of his origin, and didn't know whether to feel flattered or offended at Bazarov's unexpected familiarity. Chapter 14. A few days later, the ball at the governor's took place. Matvey Ilyich was the real hero of the occasion. The marshal of nobility declared to all and each that he had come simply out of respect for him, while the governor, even at the ball, even while he remained perfectly motionless, was still making arrangements. The affability of Matvey Ilyitch's demeanor could only be equaled by its dignity. He was gracious to all, to some with a shade of disgust, to others with a shade of respect. He was all bows and smiles, en vrai chevalier français, before the ladies, and was continually giving vent to a hearty, sonorous, unshared laugh, such as befits a high official. He slapped Arkady on the back and called him loudly nephew. Vouchsafed Bazarov, who was attired in a rather old evening coat, a sidelong glance in passing, absent but condescending, and an indistinct but affable grunt, in which nothing could be distinguished but "I" and "very much." Gave Sitnikov a finger and a smile, though with his head already averted. Even to Madame Kukshin, who made her appearance at the ball with dirty gloves, no crinoline, and a bird of paradise in her hair, he said, "Enchanté." There were crowds of people, and no lack of dancing men. The civilians were for the most part standing close along the walls, but the officers danced assiduously, especially one of them who had spent 6 weeks in Paris, where he had mastered various daring interjections of the kind of "Zut, ah fichtre, pst, pst, mon bibi," and such. He pronounced them to perfection with genuine Parisian chic, and at the same time he said "si j'aurais" for "si j'avais," absolument in the sense of absolutely. Expressed himself, in fact, in that great Russo-French jargon which the French ridicule so when they have no reason for assuring us that we speak French like angels, comme des anges. Arkady, as we are aware, danced badly, while Bazarov didn't dance at all. They both took up their position in a corner. Sitnikov joined himself onto them with an expression of contemptuous scorn on his face and giving vent to spiteful comments. He looked insolently about him and seemed to be really enjoying himself. Suddenly his face changed, and turning to Arkady, he said, with some show of embarrassment it seemed, "Odintsova is here." Arkady looked round and saw a tall woman in a black dress standing at the door of the room. He was struck by the dignity of her carriage. Her bare arms lay gracefully beside her slender waist. Gracefully, some light sprays of fuchsia drooped from her shining hair onto her sloping shoulders. Her clear eyes looked out from under a rather overhanging white brow with a tranquil and intelligent expression. Tranquil it was, precisely, not pensive. And on her lips was a scarcely perceptible smile. There was a kind of gracious and gentle force about her face. "Do you know her?" Arkady asked Sitnikov. "Intimately. Would you like me to introduce you?" "Please, after this quadrille." Bazarov's attention, too, was directed to Madame Odintsova. "It's a striking figure," he remarked. "Not like the other females." After waiting till the end of the quadrille, Sitnikov led Arkady up to Madame Odintsova. But he hardly seemed to be intimately acquainted with her. He was embarrassed in his sentences while she looked at him in some surprise. But her face assumed an expression of pleasure when she heard Arkady's surname. She asked him whether he was not the son of Nikolai Petrovich. "Yes. I have seen your father twice, and have heard a great deal about him," she went on. "I am glad to make your acquaintance." At that instant, some adjutant flew up to her and begged for a quadrille. She consented. "Do you dance, then?" asked Arkady respectfully. "Yes, I dance." "Why do you suppose I don't dance? Do you think I'm too old?" "Really, how could I possibly? But in that case, let me ask you for a mazurka." Madame Odintsova smiled graciously. "Certainly," she said. And she looked at Arkady, not exactly with an air of superiority, but as married sisters look at very young brothers. Madame Odintsova was a little older than Arkady. She was 29. But in her presence he felt himself a schoolboy, a little student, so that the difference in age between them seemed of more consequence. Matvey Ilyitch approached her with a majestic air and ingratiating speeches. Arkady moved away, but he still watched her. He could not take his eyes off her, even during the quadrille. She talked with equal ease to her partner and to the grand official, softly turned her head and eyes, and twice laughed softly. Her nose, like almost all Russian noses, was a little thick, and her complexion was not perfectly clear. Arkady made up his mind, for all that he had never before met such an attractive woman. He couldn't get the sound of her voice out of his ears. The very folds of her dress seemed to hang upon her differently from all the rest, more gracefully and amply, and her movements were distinguished by a peculiar smoothness and naturalness. Arkady felt some timidity in his heart when at the first sounds of the mazurka he began to sit it out beside his partner. He had prepared to enter into a conversation with her, but he only passed his hand through his hair and couldn't find a single word to say. But his timidity and agitation didn't last long. Madame Odintsov's tranquility gained upon him too. Before a quarter of an hour had passed, he was telling her freely about his father, his uncle, his life in Petersburg and in the country. Madame Odintsov listened to him with courteous sympathy, slightly opening and closing her fan. His talk was broken off when partners came for her. Sitnikov, among others, twice asked her. She came back, sat down again, took up her fan, and her bosom did not even heave more rapidly, while Arkady fell to chattering again, filled through and through by the happiness of being near her, talking to her, looking at her eyes, her lovely brow, all her sweet, dignified, clever face. She said little, but her words showed a knowledge of life. From some of her observations, Arkady gathered that this young woman had already felt and thought much. "Who is that you were standing with?" she asked him, "when Mr. Sitnikov brought you to me." "Did you notice him?" Arkady asked in his turn. "He has a splendid face, hasn't he? That's Bazarov, my friend." Arkady fell to discussing his friend. He spoke of him in such detail and with such enthusiasm that Madame Odintsov turned towards him and looked attentively at him. Meanwhile, the mazurka was drawing to a close. Arkady felt sorry to part from his partner. He had spent nearly an hour so happily with her. He had, it is true, during the whole time continually felt as though she were condescending to him, as though he ought to be grateful to her. But young hearts are not weighed down by that feeling. The music stopped. "Merci," said Madame Odintsov, getting up. "You promised to come and see me. Bring your friend with you. I shall be very curious to see the man who has the courage to believe in nothing." The governor came up to Madame Odintsov, announced that supper was ready, and with a careworn face offered her his arm. As she went away, she turned to give a last smile and bow to Arkady. He bowed low, looking after her. How graceful her figure seemed to him, draped in the grayish luster of the black silk. And thinking, "This minute she has forgotten my existence," was conscious of an exquisite humility in his soul. "Well," Bazarov questioned him as soon as he had gone back to him in the corner, "did you have a good time? A gentleman has just been talking to me about that lady. He said she's ooh-la-la, but I fancy the fellow was a fool. What do you think? What is she, ooh-la-la?" "I don't quite understand that definition," answered Arkady. "Oh my, what innocence!" "In that case, I don't understand the gentleman you quote. Madame Odintsov is very sweet, no doubt, but she behaves so coldly and severely that—" "Still waters, you know," put in Bazarov. "That's just what gives it piquancy. You like ices, I expect?" "Perhaps," muttered Arkady. "I can't give an opinion about that. She wishes to make your acquaintance and has asked me to bring you to see her." "I can imagine how you've described me, but you did very well. Take me. Whatever she may be, whether she's simply a provincial lioness or advanced after Kukshina's fashion, anyway, she's got a pair of shoulders such as I've not set eyes on for a long while." Arkady was wounded by Bazarov's cynicism, but, as often happens, he reproached his friend not precisely for what he did not like in him. "Why are you unwilling to allow free thinking in women?" he said in a low voice. "Because, my boy, as far as my observations go, the only free thinkers among women are frights." The conversation was cut short at this point. Both the young men went away immediately after supper. They were pursued by a nervously malicious but somewhat faint-hearted laugh from Madame Kukshin. Her vanity had been deeply wounded by neither of them having paid any attention to her. She stayed later than anyone at the ball, and at 4 o'clock in the morning she was dancing a polka mazurka with Sitnikov in the Parisian style. This edifying spectacle was the final event of the governor's ball. Chapter 15. Let's see what species of mammalia this specimen belongs to, Bazarov said to Arkady the following day as they mounted the staircase of the hotel in which Madame Odintsova was staying. I smell something wrong here. I'm surprised at you, cried Arkady. What? You? You, Bazarov, clinging to the narrow morality which... What a funny fellow you are. Bazarov cut him short carelessly. Don't you know that something wrong means something right in my dialect and for me? It's an advantage for me, of course. Didn't you tell me yourself this morning that she made a strange marriage? Though to my mind, to marry a rich old man is by no means a strange thing to do, but on the contrary, very sensible. I don't believe the gossip of the town, but I should like to think, as our cultivated governor says, that it's well-grounded. Arkady made no answer, and knocked at the door of the apartments. A young servant in livery conducted the two friends into a large room, badly furnished, like all rooms in Russian hotels, but filled with flowers. Soon Madame Odintsova herself appeared in a simple morning dress. She seemed still younger by the light of the spring sunshine. Arkady presented Bazarov and noticed with secret amazement that he seemed embarrassed, while Madame Odintsova remained perfectly tranquil, as she had been the previous day. Bazarov himself was conscious of being embarrassed and was irritated by it. Here's a go. Frightened of a petticoat, he thought. And lolling, quite like Sitnikov in an easy chair, he began talking with an exaggerated appearance of ease, while Madame Odintsova kept her clear eyes fixed on him. Anna Sergeyevna Odintsova was the daughter of Sergei Nikolaevich Lokhtov, notorious for his personal beauty, his speculations, and his gambling propensities, who, after cutting a figure and making a sensation for 15 years in Petersburg and Moscow, finished by ruining himself completely at cards, and was forced to retire to the country, where, however, he soon after died, leaving a very small property to his two daughters, Anna, a girl of 20, and Katya, a child of 12. Their mother, who came of an impoverished line of princes, the H's, had died at Petersburg when her husband was in his heyday. Anna's position after her father's death was very difficult. The brilliant education she had received in Petersburg had not fitted her for putting up with the cares of domestic life and economy, for an obscure existence in the country. She knew positively no one in the whole neighborhood, and there was no one she could consult. Her father had tried to avoid all contact with the neighbors. He despised them in his way, and they despised him in theirs. She did not lose her head, however, and promptly sent for a sister of her mother's, Princess Avdotya Stepanovna H., a spiteful and arrogant old lady who, on installing herself in her niece's house, appropriated all the best rooms for her own use, scolded and grumbled from morning till night, and would not go for a walk even in the garden unattended by her one serf, a surly footman in a threadbare pea-green livery with light blue trimming and a three-cornered hat. Anna put up patiently with all her aunt's whims, gradually set to work on her sister's education, and was, it seemed, already getting reconciled to the idea of wasting her life in the wilds. But destiny had decreed another fate for her. She chanced to be seen by Odintsov, a very wealthy man of 46, an eccentric hypochondriac, stout, heavy, and sour, but not stupid, and not ill-natured. He fell in love with her and offered her his hand. She consented to become his wife, and he lived 6 years with her, and on his death settled all his property upon her. Anna Sergeyevna remained in the country for nearly a year after his death. Then she went abroad with her sister, but only stopped in Germany. She got tired of it and came back to live at her favorite Nikolskoye, which was nearly 30 miles from the town of X. There she had a magnificent, splendidly furnished house and a beautiful garden with conservatories. Her late husband had spared no expense to gratify his fancies. Anna Sergeyevna went very rarely to the town, generally only on business, and even then she didn't stay long. She was not liked in the province. There had been a fearful outcry at her marriage with Odintsov, and all sorts of fictions were told about her. It was asserted that she had helped her father in his card-sharping tricks, and even that she had gone abroad for excellent reasons, that it had been necessary to conceal the lamentable consequences. You understand? The indignant gossips would wind up. She has gone through the fire, was said of her, to which a noted provincial wit usually added, and through all the other elements? All this talk reached her, but she turned a deaf ear to it. There was much independence and a good deal of determination in her character. Madame Odintsova sat leaning back in her easy chair and listened with folded hands to Bazarov. He, contrary to his habit, was talking a good deal and obviously trying to interest her, again a surprise for Arkady. He could not make up his mind whether Bazarov was attaining his object. It was difficult to conjecture from Anna Sergeyevna's face what impression was being made on her. It retained the same expression, gracious and refined. Her beautiful eyes were lighted up by attention, but by quiet attention. Bazarov's bad manners had impressed her unpleasantly for the first minutes of the visit, like a bad smell or a discordant sound. But she saw at once that he was nervous, and that even flattered her. Nothing was repulsive to her but vulgarity, and no one could have accused Bazarov of vulgarity. Arkady was fated to meet with surprises that day. He had expected that Bazarov would talk to a clever woman like Madame Odintsova about his opinions and his views. She had herself expressed a desire to listen to the man who dares to have no belief in anything. But instead of that, Bazarov talked about medicine, about homeopathy, and about botany. It turned out that Madame Odintsova had not wasted her time in solitude. She had read a good many excellent books and spoke herself in excellent Russian. She turned the conversation upon music, but noticing that Bazarov did not appreciate art, she quietly brought it back to botany, even though Arkady was just launching into a discourse upon the significance of national melodies. Madame Odintsova treated him as though he were a younger brother. She seemed to appreciate his good nature and youthful simplicity, and that was all. For over 3 hours, a lively conversation was kept up, ranging freely over various subjects. The friends at last got up and began to take leave. Anna Sergeyevna looked cordially at them, held out her beautiful white hand to both, and after a moment's thought said with a doubtful but delightful smile, "If you're not afraid of being bored, gentlemen, come and see me at Nikolskoye." "Oh, Anna Sergeyevna," cried Arkady, "I shall think it the greatest happiness." "And you, Monsieur Bazarov?" Bazarov only bowed, and a last surprise was in store for Arkady. He noticed that his friend was blushing. "Well," he said to him in the street, "are you still of the same opinion that she's..." "Who can tell? See how correct she is?" retorted Bazarov. And after a brief pause, he added, "She's a perfect Grand Duchess, a royal personage. She only needs a train behind her and a crown on her head." "Our Grand Duchesses don't talk Russian like that," remarked Arkady. "She's seen ups and downs, my dear boy. She's known what it is to be hard up." "Anyway, she's charming," observed Arkady. "What a magnificent body," pursued Bazarov. "Shouldn't I like to see it on the dissecting table?" "Hush, for mercy's sake, Evgeny. That's beyond everything." "Well, don't get angry, you baby. I mean, it's first rate. We must go to stay with her." "When?" "Well, why not the day after tomorrow? What is there to do here? Drink champagne with Kukshina? Listen to your cousin, the liberal dignitary? Let's be off the day after tomorrow. By the way, too, my father's little place is not far from there. This Nikolskoye on the S Road, isn't it? Yes. Optime, why hesitate? Leave that to fools and prigs. I say, what a splendid body. 3 days later, the two friends were driving along the road to Nikolskoye. The day was bright and not too hot, and the sleek posting horses trotted smartly along, switching their tied and plaited tails. Arkady looked at the road, and not knowing why, he smiled. "Congratulate me," cried Bazarov suddenly. "Today's the 22nd of June, my guardian angel's day. Let's see how he'll watch over me. Today they expect me home," he added, dropping his voice. "Well, they can go on expecting. What does it matter?" Chapter 16. The country house in which Anna Sergeyevna lived stood on an exposed hill at no great distance from a yellow stone church with a green roof, white columns, and a fresco over the principal entrance representing the resurrection of Christ in the Italian style. Sprawling in the foreground of the picture was a swarthy warrior in a helmet, specially conspicuous for his rotund contours. Behind the church, a long village stretched in 2 rows, with chimneys peeping out here and there above the thatched roofs. The manor house was built in the same style as the church, the style known among us as that of Alexander. The house, too, was painted yellow and had a green roof and white columns and a pediment with an escutcheon on it. The architect had designed both buildings with the approval of the deceased Odintsova, who could not endure, as he expressed it, idle and arbitrary innovations. The house was enclosed on both sides by the dark trees of an old garden. An avenue of lopped pines led up to the entrance. Our friends were met in the hall by 2 tall footmen in livery. One of them at once ran for the butler. The butler, a stout man in a black dress coat, promptly appeared and led the visitors by a staircase covered with rugs to a special room in which 2 bedsteads were already prepared for them, with all necessaries for the toilet. It was clear that order reigned supreme in the house. Everything was clean. Everywhere there was a peculiar delicate fragrance, just as there is in the reception rooms of ministers. "Anna Sergeyevna asks you to come to her in half an hour," the butler announced. "Will there be orders to give meanwhile?" "No orders," answered Bazarov. "Perhaps you'll be so good as to trouble yourself to bring me a glass of vodka." "Yes, sir," said the butler, looking in some perplexity, and he withdrew, his boots creaking as he walked. "What grand genre," remarked Bazarov. "That's what it's called in your set, isn't it? She's a Grand Duchess, and that's all about it." "A nice Grand Duchess," retorted Arkady. "At the very first meeting she invited such great aristocrats as you and me to stay with her. Especially me, a future doctor, and a doctor's son, and a village sexton's grandson. You know, I suppose I'm the grandson of a sexton, like the great Speransky," added Bazarov after a brief pause, contracting his lips. "At any rate, she likes to be comfortable. No, doesn't she, this lady? Oughtn't we to put on evening dress?" Arkady only shrugged his shoulders, but he, too, was conscious of a little nervousness. Half an hour later, Bazarov and Arkady went together into the drawing room. It was a large, lofty room, furnished rather luxuriously, but without particularly good taste. Heavy, expensive furniture stood in the ordinary, stiff arrangement along the walls, which were covered with cinnamon-colored paper with gold flowers on it. Odintsova had ordered the furniture from Moscow through a friend and agent of his, a spirit merchant. Over a sofa in the center of one wall hung a portrait of a faded, light-haired man, and it seemed to look with displeasure at the visitors. "It must be the late lamented," Bazarov whispered to Arkady, and turning up his nose, he added, "Hadn't we better bolt?" But at that instant, the lady of the house entered. She wore a light barège dress. Her hair, smoothly combed back behind her ears, gave a girlish expression to her pure and fresh face. "Thank you for keeping your promise," she began. You must stay a little while with me. It's really not bad here. I will introduce you to my sister. She plays the piano well. That is a matter of indifference to you, Monsieur Bazarov, but you, I think, Monsieur Kirsanov, are fond of music. Besides my sister, I have an old aunt living with me, and one of our neighbors comes in sometimes to play cards. That makes up all our circle. And now, let us sit down. Madame Odintsova delivered all this little speech with peculiar precision, as though she had learned it by heart. Then she turned to Arkady. It appeared that her mother had known Arkady's mother and had even been her confidant in her love for Nikolai Petrovich. Arkady began talking with great warmth of his dead mother, while Bazarov fell to turning over albums. I've grown quite tame, he was thinking to himself. A beautiful greyhound with a blue collar on ran into the drawing room, tapping on the floor with his paws, and after him entered a girl of 18, black-haired and dark-skinned, with a rather round but pleasing face and small dark eyes. In her hands she held a basket filled with flowers. "This is my Katya," said Madame Odintsova, indicating her with a motion of her head. Katya made a slight curtsy, placed herself beside her sister, and began picking out flowers. The greyhound, whose name was Fifi, went up to both of the visitors, in turn wagging his tail and thrusting his cold nose into their hands. "Did you pick all that yourself?" asked Madame Odintsova. "Yes," answered Katya. "Is Auntie coming to tea?" "Yes." When Katya spoke, she had a very charming smile, sweet, timid, and candid, and looked up from under her eyebrows with a sort of humorous severity. Everything about her was still young and undeveloped. The voice, and the bloom on her whole face, and the rosy hands with white palms and the rather narrow shoulders. She was constantly blushing and getting out of breath. Madame Odintsova turned to Bazarov. "You are looking at pictures from politeness, Yevgeny Vasilyevich," she began. "That does not interest you. You had better come nearer to us, and let us have a discussion about something." Bazarov went closer. "What subject have you decided upon for discussion?" he said. "What you like. I warn you, I am dreadfully argumentative." "You? Yes? That seems to surprise you. Why?" "Because, as far as I can judge, you have a calm, cool character, and one must be impulsive to be argumentative." "How can you have had time to understand me so soon?" "In the first place, I am impatient and obstinate. You should ask Katya. And secondly, I am very easily carried away." Bazarov looked at Anna Sergeyevna. "Perhaps. You must know best, and so you are inclined for a discussion, by all means. I was looking through the views of the Saxon mountains in your album, and you remarked that that couldn't interest me. You said so because you suppose me to have no feeling for art. And as a fact, I haven't any. But these views might be interesting to me from a geological standpoint. For the formation of the mountains, for instance." "Excuse me, but as a geologist, you would sooner have recourse to a book, to a special work on the subject, and not to a drawing. The drawing shows me at a glance what would be spread over 10 pages in a book." Anna Sergeyevna was silent for a little. "And so you haven't the least artistic feeling?" she observed, putting her elbow on the table, and by that very action bringing her face nearer to Bazarov. "How can you get on without it?" "Why, what is it wanted for, may I ask?" "Well, at least to enable one to study and understand men." Bazarov smiled. "In the first place, experience of life does that. And in the second, I assure you, studying separate individuals is not worth the trouble. All people are like one another, in soul as in body. Each of us has brain, spleen, heart, and lungs made alike, and the so-called moral qualities are the same in all. The slight variations are of no importance. A single human specimen is sufficient to judge of all by. People are like trees in a forest. No botanist would think of studying each individual birch tree. Katya, who was arranging the flowers, one at a time in a leisurely fashion, lifted her eyes to Bazarov with a puzzled look, and meeting his rapid and careless glance, she crimsoned up to her ears. Anna Sergeyevna shook her head. "The trees in a forest," she repeated. "Then according to you there is no difference between the stupid and the clever person, between the good-natured and ill-natured?" "No, there is a difference, just as between the sick and the healthy. The lungs of a consumptive patient are not in the same condition as yours and mine, though they are made on the same plan. We know approximately what physical diseases come from. Moral diseases come from bad education, from all the nonsense people's heads are stuffed with from childhood up, from the defective state of society. In short, reform society, and there will be no diseases." Bazarov said all this with an air as though he were all the while thinking to himself, "Believe me or not, as you like, it's all one to me." He slowly passed his fingers over his whiskers while his eyes strayed about the room. "And you conclude," observed Anna Sergeyevna, "that when society is reformed, there will be no stupid nor wicked people. At any rate, in a proper organization of society, it will be absolutely the same whether a man is stupid or clever, wicked or good." "Yes, I understand. They will all have the same spleen." "Precisely so, madam." Madame Odintsova turned to Arkady. "And what is your opinion, Arkady Nikolaevich?" "I agree with Yevgeny," he answered. Katya looked up at him from under her eyelids. "You amaze me, gentlemen," commented Madame Odintsova. "But we will have more talk together. But now I hear my aunt coming in to tea. We must spare her." Anna Sergeyevna's aunt, Princess H., a thin little woman with a pinched-up face, drawn together like a fist, and staring ill-natured-looking eyes under a gray front, came in, and scarcely bowing to the guests, she dropped into a wide velvet-covered armchair upon which no one but herself was privileged to sit. Katya put a footstool under her feet. The old lady did not thank her, did not even look at her, only her hands shook under the yellow shawl, which almost covered her feeble body. The princess liked yellow. Her cap, too, had bright yellow ribbons. "How have you slept, aunt?" inquired Madame Odintsova, raising her voice. "That dog in here again," the old lady muttered in reply, and noticing Fifi was making 2 hesitating steps in her direction, she cried, "Shh, shh." Katya called Fifi and opened the door for him. Fifi rushed out, delighted, in the expectation of being taken out for a walk, but when he was left alone outside the door, he began scratching and whining. The princess scowled. Katya was about to go out. "I expect tea is ready," said Madame Odintsova. "Come, gentlemen. Aunt, will you go into tea?" The princess got up from her chair without speaking and led the way out of the drawing room. They all followed her into the dining room. A little page in livery drew back with a scraping sound from the table an armchair covered with cushions devoted to the princess's use. She sank into it. Katya, in pouring out the tea, handed her first a cup emblazoned with a heraldic crest. The old lady put some honey in her cup. She considered it both sinful and extravagant to drink tea with sugar in it, though she never spent a kopeck herself on anything, and suddenly asked in a hoarse voice, "And what does Prince Ivan write?" No one made her any reply. Bazarov and Arkady soon guessed that they paid no attention to her, though they treated her respectfully. Because of her grand family, thought Bazarov. After tea, Anna Sergeyevna suggested they should go out for a walk. But it began to rain a little, and the whole party, with the exception of the princess, returned to the drawing room. The neighbor, the devoted card player, arrived. His name was Porfiry Platonich, a stoutish, grayish man with short, spindly legs, very polite and ready to be amused. Anna Sergeyevna, who still talked principally with Bazarov, asked him whether he'd like to try a contest with them in the old-fashioned way, at preference. Bazarov assented, saying that he ought to prepare himself beforehand for the duties awaiting him as a country doctor. You must be careful, observed Anna Sergeyevna. Porfiry Platonich and I will beat you. And you, Katya, she added, play something to Arkady Nikolaevich. He is fond of music and we can listen too. Katya went unwillingly to the piano. And Arkady, though he certainly was fond of music, unwillingly followed her. It seemed to him that Madame Odintsova was sending him away, and already, like every young man at his age, he felt a vague and oppressive emotion surging up in his heart, like the forebodings of love. Katya raised the top of the piano, and not looking at Arkady, she said in a low voice, "What am I to play you?" "What you like," answered Arkady indifferently. "What sort of music do you like best?" repeated Katya, without changing her attitude. "Classical," Arkady answered in the same tone of voice. "Do you like Mozart?" "Yes, I like Mozart." Katya pulled out Mozart's Sonata Fantasia in C minor. She played very well, though rather over-correctly and precisely. She sat upright and immovable, her eyes fixed on the notes and her lips tightly compressed. Only at the end of the sonata her face glowed, her hair came loose, and a little lock fell onto her dark brow. Arkady was particularly struck by the last part of the sonata, the part in which, in the midst of the bewitching gaiety of the careless melody, the pangs of such mournful, almost tragic suffering suddenly break in. But the ideas stirred in him by Mozart's music had no reference to Katya. Looking at her, he simply thought, well, that young lady doesn't play badly, and she's not bad-looking either. When she had finished the sonata, Katya, without taking her hands from the keys, asked, "Is that enough?" Arkady declared that he could not venture to trouble her again, and began talking to her about Mozart. He asked her whether she had chosen that sonata herself, or someone had recommended it to her. But Katya answered him in monosyllables. She withdrew into herself, went back into her shell. When this happened to her, she did not very quickly come out again. Her face even assumed at such times an obstinate, almost stupid expression. She was not exactly shy, but diffident and rather overawed by her sister, who had educated her and who had no suspicion of the fact. Arkady was reduced at last to calling Fifi to him, and with an affable smile patting him on the head to give himself an appearance of being at home. Katya set to work again upon her flowers. Bazarov, meanwhile, was losing and losing. Anna Sergeyevna played cards in masterly fashion. Porfiry Platonich, too, could hold his own in the game. Bazarov lost a sum which, though trifling in itself, was not altogether pleasant for him. At supper, Anna Sergeyevna again turned the conversation on botany. "We will go for a walk tomorrow morning," she said to him. "I want you to teach me the Latin names of the wild flowers and their species." "What use are the Latin names to you?" asked Bazarov. "Order is needed in everything," she answered. "What an exquisite woman Anna Sergeyevna is," cried Arkady when he was alone with his friend in a room assigned to them. "Yes," answered Bazarov. "A female with brains. Yes, and she's seen life, too." "In what sense do you mean that, Yevgeny Vasilyevich?" "In a good sense, my dear friend Arkady Nikolaevich. I'm convinced she manages her estate capitally, too. But what's splendid is not her, but her sister." "What? That dark little thing?" "Yes, that dark little thing. She now is fresh and untouched and shy and silent and anything you like. She's worth educating and developing. You might make something fine out of her. But the other's a stale loaf." Arkady made no reply to Bazarov, and each of them got into bed with rather singular thoughts in his head. Anna Sergeyevna, too, thought of her guests that evening. She liked Bazarov for the absence of gallantry in him, and even for his sharply defined views. She found in him something new, which she had not chanced to meet before, and she was curious. Anna Sergeyevna was a rather strange creature. Having no prejudices of any kind, Having no strong convictions even, she never gave way or went out of her way for anything. She had seen many things very clearly. She had been interested in many things. But nothing had completely satisfied her. Indeed, she hardly desired complete satisfaction. Her intellect was at the same time inquiring and indifferent. Her doubts were never soothed to forgetfulness, and they never grew strong enough to distract her. Had she not been rich and independent, she would perhaps have thrown herself into the struggle and have known passion. But life was easy for her, though she was bored at times, and she went on passing day after day with deliberation, never in a hurry, placid, and only rarely disturbed. Dreams sometimes danced in rainbow colors before her eyes even, but she breathed more freely when they died away, and didn't regret them. Her imagination indeed overstepped the limits of what is reckoned permissible by conventional morality. But even then, the blood flowed as quietly as ever in her fascinatingly graceful, tranquil body. Sometimes, coming out of her fragrant bath, all warm and enervated, she would fall to musing on the nothingness of life, the sorrow, the labor, the malice of it. Her soul would be filled with sudden daring and would flow with generous ardor, but a draft would blow from a half-closed window, and Anna Sergeyevna would shrink into herself and feel plaintive and almost angry. And there was only one thing she cared for at that instant: to get away from that horrid draft. Like all women who have not succeeded in loving, she wanted something without herself knowing what. Strictly speaking, she wanted nothing, but it seemed to her that she wanted everything. She could hardly endure the late Odintsov. She had married him from prudential motives, though probably she would not have consented to become his wife if she had not considered him a good sort of man, and had conceived a secret repugnance for all men, whom she could only figure to herself as slovenly, heavy, drowsy, and feebly importunate creatures. Once, somewhere abroad, she had met a handsome young Swede with a chivalrous expression, with honest blue eyes under an open brow. He had made a powerful impression on her, but it had not prevented her from going back to Russia. A strange man, this doctor, she thought as she lay in her luxurious bed on lace pillows under a light silk coverlet. Anna Sergeyevna had inherited from her father a little of his inclination for splendor. She had fondly loved her sinful but good-natured father, and he had idolized her, used to joke with her in a friendly way as though she were an equal, and to confide in her fully, to ask her advice. Her mother she scarcely remembered. This doctor is a strange man, she repeated to herself. She stretched, smiled, clasped her hands behind her head, then ran her eyes over 2 pages of a stupid French novel, dropped the book, and fell asleep, all pure and cold in her pure and fragrant linen. The following morning, Anna Sergeyevna went off botanizing with Bazarov right after lunch, and returned just before dinner. Arkady did not go off anywhere and spent about an hour with Katya. He was not bored with her. She offered of herself to repeat the sonata of the day before, but when Madame Odintsova came back at last, when he caught sight of her, he felt an instantaneous pang at his heart. She came through the garden with a rather tired step. Her cheeks were glowing and her eyes shining more brightly than usual under her round straw hat. She was twirling in her fingers the thin stalk of a wildflower. A light mantle had slipped down to her elbows, and the wide gray ribbons of her hat were clinging to her bosom. Bazarov walked behind her, self-confident and careless as usual. But the expression of his face, cheerful and even friendly as it was, did not please Arkady. Muttering between his teeth, good morning, Bazarov went away to his room, while Madame Odintsova shook Arkady's hand abstractedly, and also walked past him. Good morning, thought Arkady, as though we hadn't seen each other already today.